Canada has brought down interest rates by almost 3 full percentage points since 2024, but you reckon more is needed?
Well, the proof of the pudding is always in the eating. So, the bank has cut the policy rate by 275 basis points. Of course, the only people that borrow at the overnight rate are the banks. And nobody borrows at that rate, and other interest rates haven't fallen nearly.
The Canadian economy is currently facing multiple challenges all at the same time. People and businesses across the country are struggling with high inflation, meaning that the prices of everyday goods and services are rising faster than incomes. At the same time, trade tariffs imposed by other countries have made it more expensive for Canadian companies to buy and sell goods internationally, creating additional pressure on the economy.
Of condos are left unsold. The Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation says about 2,500 new condos are sitting empty in Metro Vancouver. That's double what it was last year. And in Toronto, the CMHC says the weakening condo market appears to have similarities to the crash of the early 90s. Escalating costs from material and labor are some of the factors behind this market. The Canadian economy, already contending with inflation, tariffs, and a cost of living crisis, is also watching a steady and ongoing slump in the housing.
On top of these issues, many Canadians are feeling the effects of a general cost of living crisis, where everyday expenses such as groceries, utilities, and transportation are becoming harder to manage. Alongside these ongoing challenges, the housing market in Canada has been showing a steady and ongoing decline, making it even more difficult for people to invest in or afford homes.
Call it structural issues with the economy, are developments that transcend the power of the central bank. But at the same time, if I were in Ottawa and I were in his shoes, I would be doing all I possibly can. Inflation in this country is not really an issue. Virtually every underlying inflation measure is comfortably within the Bank of Canada's comfort zone.
According to a recent report from Rosenberg Research, the Canadian economy is now being described as on life support, suggesting that the overall economic situation is very fragile. The report highlights that in the last 3 quarters, the country's economy has likely shrunk in 2 of them, which is a sign that economic growth has slowed significantly. This pattern points to a period where growth is very weak, and the country may even be facing potential recessionary pressure, where the economy could contract further and affect jobs, incomes, and investments across the nation.
New report from Rosenberg Research says that the Canadian economy is on life support and that the economy probably shrank in 2 of the past 3 quarters.
That other countries are getting better faster, and there are areas like inequality where Canada's performance has deteriorated over the last decade or 2.
And we are on a clear recession watch for 2026.
In response to these difficult economic conditions, the Bank of Canada has taken action by reducing interest rates sharply. Since the spring of 2024, the bank has lowered its main policy rate by a total of 275 basis points. To put this in simpler terms, the rate cuts have almost added up to 3 full percentage points. The purpose of lowering interest rates is to encourage borrowing and spending, which in theory should help stimulate economic activity.
We got the monthly data late last week. The GDP trend is running at roughly 1%. The 4th quarter sequentially, as you mentioned in your preliminary remarks, is probably going to be fractionally negative. And I'm trying to look around for, what the source of vitality is going to be. I'm really quite surprised that most Bay Street economists have an inflation view, or at least some of them do.
Lower interest rates make it cheaper for businesses to invest in growth and for people to borrow money for things like homes, cars, or other major expenses. However, despite this strong effort from the central bank, economic growth in Canada has remained very low. Real per capita GDP, which is the total value of goods and services produced in the country divided by the population, continues to fall. This measure is important because it shows how much economic output is available for each person.
I think we need to ask ourselves, are we doing better in a more holistic sense? So, not just what GDP tells us, but, quality of life, standard of living, inequality, and so on.
So we came off rates that were very elevated. But it's clear to me, unless the policy lags are just a lot longer this time around, that if this is what 275 basis points of Bank Canada rate cuts delivers, the grand total of a 1% growth.
It kind of reminds me of the interest rate policy in the wake of the 2007-2008 banking crisis. Low interest rates didn't seem to stimulate growth then.
A declining real per capita GDP means that, on average, Canadians are effectively seeing a reduction in their economic prosperity and overall standard of living. The housing sector, in particular, has not seen significant improvements even with these lower borrowing costs. Across the country, national home prices have remained mostly flat, and in some cases, they have slightly decreased.
I'm a little surprised that the Bank Canada is taking such a strident approach. I do think that they will be compelled to cut rates further, even from this egregiously low interest rate. And I think the Canadian dollar, which I had been bullish on tactically, is going to come under some renewed downward pressure at the same time, because there's a case to be made that the Fed probably doesn't do anything at all, at least through the first half of.
Canadians are struggling at the grocery stores, and grocers are adapting. So we're not dealing with an overstored market in Canada. There's still plenty of space for growth, but things are getting.
Over the past 10 months in a row, home prices have fallen by roughly 2% compared to the same time the previous year. This indicates that the housing market is struggling, and that lower interest rates alone have not been enough to encourage people to buy homes at previous levels. In Metro Vancouver, the situation has been especially noticeable.
I've kind of taken the other approach and saying, well, actually not so fast. So GDP per capita, we're doing pretty well in, but other indicators such as wealth and income inequality, deaths of despair, and so on, we tend to actually be below the average of kind of Western.
Especially when it comes to discretionary revenues, the money that people have to spend at the grocery.
Canada should be taking the same attitude. We should be trying to be better than we were last year, not comparing ourselves to one of 50 U.S. states.
The Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation has reported that about 2,500 newly built condominium units remain empty. These are brand new homes that have never been lived in, and this number represents a doubling of unsold units compared to last year. Such a high level of unsold inventory suggests that there is weak demand for condominiums, possibly because many people cannot afford them or are hesitant to buy under current economic conditions.
I also think, at the end of the day, we should be asking ourselves, are we doing as well as we could be doing? I think that's the most important part, that I don't think we should be trying to compete with Alabama, but rather, I always saw it in sports. I always wanted to be better today than I was.
Although the population trends have slowed with the immigration rule changes, real per capita GDP in Canada is still declining. That has not been a.
At the same time, the total mortgage debt that Canadian households are carrying has continued to rise. Across the country, total mortgage obligations now exceed $2.1 trillion, which is an enormous sum. What is even more concerning is that mortgage interest payments have increased by over 90% since 2022, while principal payments, the portion of the mortgage that actually reduces the loan, have fallen by around 47%.
The economy is growing below potential, and the Bank Canada's own forecast, when you dig through the details, is for this disinflationary output gap to be with us, not just this year, but through the end of 2020.
Provinces had an average GDP per capita equivalent to Alabama back in 2022, but then that figure shrank over the next 2 years. It has sparked an awful lot of debate among experts. Some said GDP per capita is a lousy way to measure wealth.
This combination means that homeowners are paying much more in interest while building less equity in their homes, which can make it harder for them to improve their financial position or sell their homes if needed. The rising mortgage burden puts significant strain on household budgets and leaves less money for other expenses such as education, healthcare, and daily living costs.
Question is, since the Bank of Canada started cutting interest rates in the spring of 2024, what's the Canadian economy done over this time span? And it's barely better than a 1% annualized growth performance. It's, mathematically wasn't wrong that a lot of
The federal government of Canada has also been carrying a much higher level of debt in recent years. In 2019, the federal debt was reported to be around $721 billion. In the most recent estimates, however, this figure has grown to approximately $1.29 trillion, showing a significant increase in just a few years. With higher debt levels comes higher costs to pay interest on that debt. Currently, interest payments on federal debt total about $54 billion every year, making debt servicing one of the fastest growing expenses in the national budget.
There are a variety of trends going on. There's a stronger recovery one sees in terms of prices in eastern parts of Canada. But then in places like Ontario, especially Toronto, and to the very west in Vancouver or British Columbia, you see a bit of struggle in the markets, in their market.
At the UN Human Development Index, which takes into account a variety of different factors. Back in the 1990s, we were consistently in the top 3. We're now down to 16th place in the latest report. There's a World Happiness Report, also a UN initiative. Just a decade ago, we were the 6th best country in the world.
This increase in debt obligations puts additional pressure on government finances, potentially limiting the ability to fund programs, infrastructure, or other public priorities. Another important factor affecting the Canadian economy is population growth, which has been very rapid in recent years. Since 2021, the country has added roughly 3.22 million new residents, which is roughly equivalent to adding the population of 2 cities the size of Toronto in just 3 years.
Over the past year, prices have climbed in more affordable cities, up almost 7% in Regina, nearly 10% in St. John's, about 17% in Quebec City. But in big, expensive cities, the slowdown has been sharp, with prices falling 4.5% in Vancouver and more than 6%.
It is the lowest since record-keeping began almost 5 decades ago. According to Ontario's financial watchdog, manufacturing jobs as a share of Ontario's total employment fell below 10% for the first time since 19...
This significant population growth has naturally increased demand for housing, public services, and infrastructure. However, job creation has not kept pace with the rising population. For roughly every new job created, 2 new people have been added to the population. This imbalance means that population growth is outstripping employment opportunities, creating pressure on the labor market and contributing to economic stress. It also adds to the demand for housing, which has already been under strain due to affordability challenges and high mortgage debt. Construction activity in Canada's residential sector has reached record levels. Currently, there are about 421,000 homes under construction, which includes single-family homes, townhouses, and condominiums. On the surface, this might seem like a positive sign, showing that builders are trying to meet the demand for homes. However, despite this record level of construction, the housing market is still struggling. Builders are facing a high number of cancellations, with many developers walking away from projects even in the middle of construction. The main reasons for these challenges include increased borrowing costs, difficulties in financing projects, and slower than expected pre-sales. This situation highlights that even with a large number of new homes being built, many of them are not being successfully sold, leaving developers and buyers in difficult positions. Taken together, these factors paint a picture of an economy under significant pressure. Canadians are dealing with rising costs, slow economic growth, and a housing market that is not performing as expected. Interest rate cuts by the Bank of Canada have so far not been enough to reverse these trends, and households continue to face high levels of debt and interest payments. Population growth, while generally a positive factor for the long-term economy, has outpaced job creation and added further strain on housing and services. Record levels of construction have not been able to compensate for weak demand, leaving developers with unfinished or unsold projects. The combination of these pressures suggests that Canada is experiencing a challenging period where economic growth is slow, debt levels are rising, and many people feel the effects of inflation and affordability issues in their daily lives. The Canadian economy is currently facing multiple challenges all at the same time. People and businesses across the country are struggling with high inflation, meaning that the prices of everyday goods and services are rising faster than incomes. At the same time, trade tariffs imposed by other countries have made it more expensive for Canadian companies to buy and sell goods internationally, creating additional pressure on the economy. On top of these issues, many Canadians are feeling the effects of a general cost of living crisis, where everyday expenses such as groceries, utilities, and transportation are becoming harder to manage. Alongside these ongoing challenges, the housing market in Canada has been showing a steady and ongoing decline, making it even more difficult for people to invest in or afford homes. According to a recent report from Rosenberg Research, the Canadian economy is now being described as on life support, suggesting that the overall economic situation is very fragile. The report highlights that in the last 3 quarters, the country's economy has likely shrunk in 2 of them, which is a sign that economic growth has slowed significantly. This pattern points to a period where growth is very weak, and the country may even be facing potential recessionary pressure, where the economy could contract further and affect jobs, incomes, and investments across the nation. Ontario, which has long been recognized as the manufacturing and economic heart of Canada, is now showing signs of significant weakness. The province has traditionally been a hub for industrial activity, with factories, plants, and manufacturing facilities forming a central part of its economy. However, recent data from Ontario's financial oversight authorities reveal that manufacturing jobs now make up less than 10% of total employment in the province. This is the first time this has happened since 1976, marking a major shift in the composition of the province's labor market over several decades. The decline indicates that industrial production is playing a much smaller role in providing employment than it once did, and the province is now more reliant on service sector jobs and other non-manufacturing industries to sustain its economy. This long-term reduction in manufacturing employment highlights structural changes in the provincial economy and raises concerns about the future strength and competitiveness of Ontario's industrial sector. Alongside declining employment in manufacturing, the overall output of Ontario's factories and industrial operations is contracting. Year-over-year figures show that manufacturing activity in the province has dropped by around 5%, meaning that factories are producing less than they did at the same time last year. This contraction comes at a time when external conditions would typically support stronger industrial growth. For example, the Canadian dollar has weakened compared to the US dollar, which would normally make Ontario's exports cheaper and more competitive in international markets. In addition, demand from the United States has remained relatively strong, which would usually provide a tailwind for Ontario's manufacturers. Despite these seemingly favorable conditions, exports from the province are still lower than they were in the spring of 2022. These statistics suggest that Ontario's industrial sector is underperforming relative to expectations and facing underlying challenges that are preventing it from benefiting fully from global market conditions. The Canadian dollar itself has been experiencing a period of depreciation against several other currencies. In recent months, it has lost about 4% of its value compared to currencies like the Australian dollar and the New Zealand dollar. This decline signals ongoing challenges in maintaining currency strength and competitiveness, particularly relative to other economies that are heavily driven by commodities. A weaker Canadian dollar has a mixed impact on the economy. While it can help exporters by making Canadian goods cheaper for foreign buyers, it also increases the cost of imports, including essential items such as machinery, electronics, and consumer goods. This currency depreciation therefore places additional strain on households and businesses that rely on imported products, further complicating the overall economic environment. Housing prices in Canada are displaying different trends depending on the region and the type of city. In smaller and more affordable cities, prices have continued to increase steadily. For instance, in Regina, housing prices have gone up by nearly 7% over the past year. St. John's has seen a nearly 10% rise, and Quebec City has experienced a substantial increase of approximately 17%. These gains indicate that demand for housing remains strong in smaller urban centers, possibly due to more manageable prices, growing local employment, and population movements away from larger cities. However, in Canada's larger urban centers, where housing has historically been more expensive, the market has been slowing down. In Vancouver, for example, home prices have fallen by around 4.5%, while in Toronto, prices have declined by more than 6%. The difference in these trends shows that affordability and market saturation are key factors influencing the housing market. Larger cities continue to struggle with high costs and limited accessibility, while smaller cities see continued growth in demand and pricing. A growing concern for Canadian households involves mortgage renewals in the coming years. Many families who secured mortgage rates at historically low levels between 2020 and 2022 will be faced with higher interest rates when their mortgages come up for renewal between 2025 and 2027. For example, a household that previously had a mortgage rate of around 2% may soon be required to renew at rates of 5 or 6%. This represents a substantial increase in monthly payments, and it is likely to have a significant impact on household budgets. Families may need to cut back on discretionary spending, delay other investments, or adjust their financial planning to accommodate these higher payments. The anticipated rise in mortgage costs is a critical issue for many Canadian households, especially those who purchased homes at the peak of the market or took on higher levels of debt during the period of historically low rates. Across the country, new housing developments are also facing challenges, particularly in the condominium sector. Developers are finding it increasingly difficult to complete projects due to rising material and labor costs. Additionally, financing expenses have increased, and pre-sales are slower than expected, meaning that potential buyers are not committing to new homes as quickly as developers had anticipated. These difficulties are causing some projects to stall, while others are being abandoned entirely. As a result, even though construction activity remains high, the overall housing market continues to feel strain. The combination of rising costs, financial challenges, and weak demand in certain markets contributes to a complex and difficult environment for both developers and prospective homeowners. The Bank of Canada has responded to these economic challenges with aggressive monetary stimulus. Since 2024, the bank has cut its policy rate by a total of 275 basis points, which amounts to nearly 3 full percentage points. This reduction is intended to encourage borrowing, stimulate spending, and support economic activity. Lower interest rates make it cheaper for households and businesses to borrow money, which should, in theory, increase investment and consumer spending. Despite these rate cuts, however, Canada's economy has only achieved minimal growth. GDP per capita remains low, meaning that the overall economic output per person is not rising at a meaningful pace. Real per-person economic output continues to decline, suggesting that households and the population are not seeing significant benefits from economic expansion. The measures taken by the central bank have not yet been sufficient to reverse or substantially improve the country's economic trajectory. Canada's federal debt has also grown substantially in recent years. In 2019, the federal debt was reported at roughly $721 billion. In the most recent estimates, this figure has increased to about $1.29 trillion. Interest payments on this debt now total approximately $54 billion per year, making debt servicing one of the fastest-growing areas of federal spending. This increase in debt obligations places ongoing pressure on government finances and limits the ability to allocate resources to other areas such as infrastructure, healthcare, or social programs. The rising federal debt is a key factor influencing Canada's fiscal landscape and presents challenges for long-term economic stability. Population growth in Canada has been rapid, adding approximately 3.22 million new residents since 2021. This growth has increased demand for housing, public services, and infrastructure. However, employment creation has not kept pace with the rising population. For every one new job created, 2 people have been added to the population, highlighting a mismatch between labor supply and job opportunities. This imbalance adds further pressure to the labor market and contributes to economic stress as more residents compete for fewer available positions. The high population growth also amplifies challenges in the housing market, as additional residents increase demand for homes that are already constrained by affordability issues. Construction activity across the country has reached record levels. There are currently around 421,000 homes under construction in Canada, which includes single-family homes, townhouses, and condominiums. Despite this high level of activity, builders are facing high cancellation rates, with many developers abandoning projects even in the middle of construction. Rising borrowing costs, financing difficulties, and slower pre-sales are the main reasons for these cancellations. This situation demonstrates that while construction activity is strong in terms of volume, the housing market continues to struggle due to underlying economic and financial challenges. Builders are finding it difficult to complete projects successfully, which affects both the supply of new homes and the overall health of the housing sector. Looking specifically at Ontario, the province's industrial sector is under particular stress. Manufacturing employment has fallen below 10% of total provincial employment for the first time since 1976. Output in the manufacturing sector is down 5% year over year, and exports are lower than they were in the spring of 2022. These trends indicate that Ontario's industrial and export sectors are facing ongoing challenges, including declining production, weaker international sales, and slower growth compared to expectations. The weakening industrial base has implications for the broader economy, affecting employment, household incomes, and regional economic stability. Meanwhile, the Canadian dollar has experienced a decline of approximately 4% against other commodity-driven currencies, such as the Australian and New Zealand dollars. This depreciation reflects the relative weakness of Canada's domestic economic growth compared to other countries and poses challenges for trade and investment. A weaker dollar can help some exporters, but it also increases costs for imported goods and raises concerns for households and businesses that rely on foreign products and materials. Housing prices continue to show mixed trends. In smaller Canadian cities such as Regina, St. John's, and Quebec City, prices have risen by roughly 7%, 10%, and 17%, respectively. In contrast, in larger urban centers such as Vancouver and Toronto, prices have declined by approximately 4.5% and more than 6%. These differences reflect variations in affordability, supply and demand dynamics, and local economic conditions, showing that the housing market is not uniform across the country. Finally, mortgage renewals between 2025 and 2027 are expected to create financial pressure for many households. Families who locked in mortgage rates of around 2% in previous years will face new rates of 5 or 6%, significantly increasing monthly payments. This increase will have a direct and immediate impact on household budgets, forcing families to make difficult decisions about spending, saving, and financial planning in the years ahead. Ontario, which has long been recognized as the manufacturing and economic heart of Canada, is now showing signs of significant weakness. The province has traditionally been a hub for industrial activity, with factories, plants, and manufacturing facilities forming a central part of its economy. However, recent data from Ontario's financial oversight authorities reveal that manufacturing jobs now make up less than 10% of total employment in the province. This is the first time this has happened since 1976, marking a major shift in the composition of the province's labor market over several decades.